New York 1859 or 1860. No one saw when he arrived, nor when he became a threat, nor when he became a legend. His name wasn't born from blood, but from absence, of parents, of care, of law. Before he was Billy the Kid, he was Henry McCarty, a forgotten face in the alleys of New York. The exact date of his birth was lost with time, like almost everything about him. Some say it was 1859, maybe 1860. What matters is that he came into the world already doomed to disappear. His father vanished early, like so many men who promised more than they could deliver. His mother, Catherine, took her two young sons west, trying to escape poverty and the past. They arrived in New Mexico at a time when the territory was more myth than map. In 1873, she married William Antrim, an unstable man who would soon abandon the family. And when tuberculosis claimed Catherine in 1874, the boy was left with little more than dust in his pockets and his last name as his only inheritance, orphaned at 14, alone in a land where boys became men with a revolver on their hip, or corpses. Henry tried to survive any way he could, washing dishes, serving tables, selling scrap. But the world didn't want his work, only his obedience, and he wasn't the obedient type. In September 1875, he was arrested for stealing clothes from a Chinese laundry in Silver City, thrown into an adobe cell. 2 days later, he climbed up the chimney and vanished, the first of many escapes. From that moment on, he began using another name, William H. Bonney, a new name for a life that could no longer be the same. He was running from misery, from loneliness, from hunger, but also towards something. He didn't yet know what, but he ran fast. By 16, he was already crossing Arizona, walking into taverns like he was born there, light, quick, charming, but with cold eyes. He wasn't tall. He had protruding teeth and a boyish face, but there was something about him that drew attention, a dry, dangerous, magnetic confidence. He killed for the first time in 1877 a Mexican blacksmith named Frank Windy Cahill. The fight started with fists and ended with a gunshot. Billy claimed self-defense and fled, again. From then on, life would be a blur of gunfire and distances. There was no turning back. He joined gangs of gunmen riding the edges of law in a territory where what was right changed with the mood of the man holding the nearest weapon. He was no longer Henry nor William. He was the Kid. The nickname spread faster than his footsteps, a boy who killed grown men, a child's smile with a predator's eyes, a name that brought silence to saloon conversations. He tried, for a brief moment, to live as though the world wasn't chasing him. After his mother's death and his stepfather's abandonment, Henry McCarty, already shaped by loss, sought shelter under the same roof as William Antrim in Camp Grant, Arizona. But shelter isn't home. And Billy no longer knew how to stay still. He wasn't made of roots. He was made of quick steps and sharp eyes. Life with Antrim was short and strained. The man had another family now, other interests. The frail boy who would become a legend was an inconvenience. The silence between them was thick as mud. And when doors stopped opening for Henry, he learned to open them by force or climb through the windows. Around this time, he committed one of his first significant crimes, stealing weapons from a military camp. It wasn't just about the guns. It was the act itself, the risk, the defiance. A 16-year-old boy challenging armed soldiers, challenging order, challenging the very logic of fear. With stolen guns in hand and the law at his back, he fled to Arizona. A new land, new faces, new names. There he tried once again to become invisible. Worked as a ranch hand, tending cattle and riding across the endless plains like countless others. But Billy was never meant to be just another face. He was charismatic, daring, and naturally gifted at drawing attention, even the wrong kind. He spent nights in smoky saloons, gambling with quick hands and wary eyes. Developed a habit for betting, earning more enemies than coins. The table became a battlefield, every card a risk, every debt a potential death sentence. It was in this world of wagers and danger that he found another trade, horse theft. First as a watcher, then as an accomplice, and soon as a professional. Horses were worth more than gold in that fenceless land, and Billy knew how to ride them, how to lead them, how to vanish with them before sunrise. The authorities started to notice. The name William H. Bonney appeared in reports, freshly adopted, almost respectable, but those who saw him up close knew it was a mask, a disguise for a boy becoming more dangerous by the day. Kid, the nickname began as a joke, a clean-faced boy who looked like he'd walked straight from school into a gunfight. Men laughed when they saw him the first time, small, thin, smiling, but the smile never lasted long. Once the gun appeared, there was no time for another expression. The nickname stuck, not because it was funny, but because it was true. He was the Kid. A boy among men, a novice who killed veterans, a young face carrying death in his eyes. By late 1877, the transformation was complete. In a saloon in Bonita, Arizona, a provocation turned to tragedy. The local blacksmith, the same Frank Windy Cahill, started an argument with Billy. Maybe over gambling debts, maybe out of contempt, maybe because big men always think they can crush small ones. The fight began with fists. Cahill threw Billy to the ground with brutal ease, but the boy wasn't one to take a beating quietly. Amid the dust of the wooden floor, he drew his revolver and fired. A single shot. Cahill fell and never rose again. The blacksmith died the next day. Billy, his hands still trembling, ran. He knew what he'd done. He knew what was coming. From that moment on, there was no going back. He wasn't just a thief anymore. He was a killer. He was captured soon after by cavalry officers and taken to Fort Grant. They held him in custody. But holding the Kid was like trying to trap lightning with ropes of cloth. Before they could transfer him for trial, he escaped again. Some say he waited until the guards slept. Some say he tricked the sentries. Some say he simply vanished. No one knew exactly how he did it, only that he did. And what he left behind wasn't just bodies and questions, but the certainty that they were witnessing something new, something dangerous. With a boy's face and a trail of ghosts, Billy the Kid was no longer just a man. He was becoming a story. He ran, and the landscape ran with him. Sand, sky, sweat, thirst. The border wasn't a line but a veil of dust rising between one name and the next. Billy or Henry or William, it no longer mattered. He was the one who ran, the one who left faces behind, the one who never went back to reclaim what was lost. During his long flight from Arizona, he lost almost everything, his guns, his few coins, his fleeting allies, but nothing stung as much as losing his horse, taken by a small Apache band that crossed his path with silent eyes and ready weapons. They didn't want a fight, they wanted the animal. And Billy knew the kind of violence that doesn't negotiate. He handed over the reins and was left with dust and humiliation. Sick, feverish, and without transport, he walked alone toward New Mexico. Days and nights of dehydration and hallucinations. Anyone who saw him then would never imagine they were looking at the future's most feared face. He was just another lost boy among the bones of the desert. But there, between weakness and hunger, he found shelter and a new fate. He was taken in by a group of cattle rustlers led by Jesse Evans, a name already whispered across the plains and saloons. Those men didn't ask where you came from. They asked if you could ride, shoot, and keep your mouth shut. Billy could do all three. In no time, he went from a quiet recruit to an essential part of the gang. At 17, he was already crossing ranches at night, cutting fences, driving cattle, deceiving foremen. Cattle theft was more than a crime. It was an alternate economy. And in New Mexico, the law was a thin shadow behind dust and greed. The boy's reputation grew, but one thing remained unsettled: his name. Henry McCarty was a trace. The Kid was a nickname. During this period, he officially adopted the name that would follow him into eternity: William H. Bonney. Simple, sharp, invented, perfect. And under that name, he stepped into the conflict that would change everything. The year was 1878. New Mexico was a powder keg, and Billy Bonney held the lit match. The Lincoln County War didn't start over ideology. It started over money. The territory, not yet formally part of the United States, was a world of private disputes where judges, sheriffs, and gunmen often served the same master. There were two main factions. On one side, Lawrence Murphy and James Dolan, owners of the store that controlled nearly all commerce in Lincoln County. They had the backing of local law, the bank, and hired guns. On the other, a young Englishman named John Tunstall, who dared to challenge their monopoly with his own store and cattle herd. He was rich, educated, and wanted to run business the English way, with contracts and limits. But the Old West didn't speak that language. Tunstall needed protection. He gathered a group of hired gunmen under legal contract, blessed by a local judge. They were officially called the Regulators, legal vigilantes. Among them was Billy Bonney. For the first time, he stood on the right side of the law, or so it seemed. But in this land, legality was relative. Change the sheriff, and you change the definition of crime and justice. Every week power shifted like a rusty roulette wheel. When John Tunstall was ambushed and murdered, the Regulators swore revenge. What followed wasn't an investigation, it was war. Billy personally took part in the assassination of Sheriff William Brady, seen as an accomplice of their enemies. It was a symbolic, brutal act, killing the man of the law in broad daylight in the open street. No disguise, no excuse, just a clear message. The Regulators would no longer ask for permission. The following weeks were a cycle of ambushes, gunfights, and the burning of human records. Men on both sides were gunned down in barn shadows, saloon corners, and dusty crossroads. The entire territory turned into a battlefield. The town of Lincoln became a war zone, houses under siege, windows barricaded, empty streets, and bullets crossing the morning air like clocks of death. Billy Bonney became the most repeated and feared name in conversation. He was fast, precise, unstoppable. He killed without hesitation and vanished as if the desert itself cleared the path. His youth, once a joke, now made him seem almost supernatural. A boy killing sheriffs, facing armed militias, defying authority with a crooked grin and a gun in hand. But this war was just a symptom of something bigger. The Old West was, in practice, an occupied zone with no central command. The United States was expanding its frontier, but federal law was weak, slow, and absent. Power belonged to whoever had more men, more bullets, or more money to buy both. Arizona and New Mexico in those years were lands with paper borders and gunpowder justice. The land was vast, hard to patrol, the distances deadly. Trials often happened at the same place as the crimes, with the same executors. Armed cowboys, vigilantes, thieves, mercenaries, all shared the same ground. Sheriffs became outlaws. Outlaws became deputies. All it took was a signature or a badge. The line between criminal and authority evaporated under the scorching sun, and on that stage, lawless, curtainless, Billy Bonney wrote his chapter of history. Not with words, but with gunfire, speed, and silence. He wasn't a revolutionary nor a martyr. He was a consequence, a product of a world where justice wasn't a right, but a weapon. And among them all, he wielded it best. What began as a business dispute became a private war. What began as a duel between merchants turned into a faceless massacre. When the first men fell, you could still name the guilty. When the last ones died, no one remembered why they were shooting, only that it was too late to stop. Lincoln County in 1878 was no longer a territory. It was an open wound. On one side, the Regulators, now more militia than lawmen, men once paid to protect Tunstall, now driven by revenge, wounded pride, and for some, fame. On the other, the allies of the old order, the Dolan-Murphy gang, Irish ranchers, merchants, and gunmen, backed by political contracts and territorial connections. It was a war between two informal armies, each with support where it mattered, one with the people, the other with politics. The law was bought. Order was corrupted. Each side believed it served justice. Neither was right. Neither would yield. Governor Lew Wallace watched from afar, hesitant, powerless, perhaps complicit. The federal army didn't intervene. The local sheriff, allied with Dolan, wore his badge like a license to kill. And newspapers began printing names, lists of the dead, accounts of shootouts. With every headline, Billy Bonney became more than a gunman. He became the protagonist of a lawless tragedy. Between February and June, the county turned into an ambush field. Riders shot dead by riverbanks. Houses burned with families inside. Bodies hung from trees or disappeared into the desert. no funerals, no peace. Billy appeared in nearly every account. Fast, efficient, lethal. More shadow than man. He was the tip of the regulator's spear. He gave no orders, only executions. With cold eyes and few words, he entered and left towns like a ghost in spurs. Some said he rarely smiled, that he took no pleasure in killing, but never hesitated either. He was the perfect product of his world, a boy raised by injustice, fed by violence, protected by instinct. All of it exploded in the bloodiest event of the war, the Battle of Lincoln. In July 1878, the final siege began. The regulators, now barely a dozen men, took refuge in the home of Alexander McSween, Tunstall's old ally. On the other side, James Dolan and his gunmen joined forces with new Sheriff George Pepin, who gathered about 40 men armed to the teeth, criminals, ranch hands, and mercenaries. Their goal was clear: wipe out the regulators once and for all. The siege began as a blockade. McSween's house was surrounded. The regulators manned the windows, rifles ready but ammunition short. The summer heat glued dust to their skin. The gunfire started on the second day, 5 days of crossfire, 5 days without rest. Bullets scratched the sky like metal moths. The house walls shattered into splinters. Outside, the attackers laughed, drank, and fired. Inside, the regulators sweated, bled, and waited. Billy didn't stand still. He led counterattacks, shot with precision, killed without hesitation. He wasn't the leader, but men followed him, because he never trembled. That week, Billy killed 3 men, including one of the sheriff's East lieutenants and a gunman who tried to break into the kitchen. One of the dead was Sheriff Brady himself, shot down in open exchange, a message that the regulators still bit back. The fight ended on the 5th day with a brutal act. Dolan's men set the house ablaze. Flames rose like liquid vengeance. Smoke climbed with the heat of bullets. McSween refused to flee, tried to reason, tried to negotiate. He was gunned down at the door. The survivors escaped through the back. Among them, Billy. As the house burned and bullets crossed the yard, he pulled 2 wounded allies through the windows, dragged them under heavy fire, and vanished into the brush. They say he was the last to leave. They say he turned, aimed, and held off the attackers for precious seconds. They say he fired, hit his mark, and ran, as if hell itself were chasing him. Maybe it's not all true. But when it comes to Billy the Kid, what they say often matters more than what can be proven. When the flames died, 22 people were dead. The town looked like a gravestone. The streets, open graves. The army finally arrived. Too late. Federal troops marched into Lincoln to restore order. Most of the regulators fled before dawn, vanishing like dust in the wind. The war ended there, not by treaty but by exhaustion. Dolan won on paper. His store reopened. His allies took public office. But something had changed. The victory came at a cost. The people no longer saw them as legitimate. And in the minds of the people, it wasn't Dolan who rose higher. It was Billy. The boy no one took seriously. The one who started washing dishes. The one who crawled up chimneys to escape. The one who faced 40 armed men and escaped a burning house with 3 corpses on his belt. He was no longer just a gunman. He was a symbol, and symbols cannot be jailed, nor burned, nor forgotten. The war was over, but Billy wasn't. When the dust settled over Lincoln County, when the papers stopped counting the dead and the politicians pretended to have control again, he still rode the dark trails of New Mexico, wind in his eyes, the law at his back. The regulators scattered. Some died. Others became ranch hands, carpenters, forgotten names, but Billy remained, as if he didn't know how to exist without war. Without an army, without a cause, without command, he became the informal leader of a new gang of outlaws, a mix of new faces and old survivors, a small band, but with a heavy name at its center. He didn't seek conflict, but he didn't run from it either. During a trial in Massilia, Billy watched a prosecutor get executed in cold blood by another gunman inside the courtroom. Chaos returned. No one was punished. Justice was still traded like hay and cattle, and Billy knew that better than anyone. In that climate of cynicism came an unexpected offer. Territorial Governor Lew Wallace, tired of the scandal and Billy's growing fame, saw an opportunity. He offered a pardon in exchange for Billy's testimony in the prosecutor's murder case. Billy, longing to end his life as a fugitive, accepted. He wrote letters to the governor, testified at the trial, gave names, and waited. But the pardon never came. The governor broke the deal, publicly denied the pact, claimed Billy hadn't kept his word, even though he had risked his life to testify. It wasn't just betrayal, it was a message. There was no redemption for men like him. The boy smiled, a tired, hollow smile, and escaped prison once again, slipping past unsuspecting guards into the night like so many times before. Not out of rage, not even haste. Only conviction that he was alone in the world, and alone he would live or die. From that point on, Billy the Kid was no longer a legend in the making. He was a man condemned to memory. He returned to the only life he knew, crossing invisible borders through the desert, stopping in small villages, sheltered by innkeepers, farmers, and cowhands who still saw something noble in him, a rebel, a survivor, a ghost with a boy's face. But the net was tightening. Billy knew he couldn't run forever, yet his last crimes weren't born of greed, but instinct, like breathing. One night, riding between Fort Sumner and White Oaks, he was ambushed by a bounty hunter, a lone man sworn to bring him in dead or alive. The man thought he had the advantage. Billy reacted with the same speed and cold precision that made him legend. One shot, then silence. The body stayed behind. He rode on. Soon after, a lawman tried to arrest him in a hilltop camp. There was gunfire. The lawman fell. Billy vanished again. The bounty for his head rose. Newspapers spoke of $400, a fortune for the time. Not just because he was dangerous, but because he was humiliating. Billy represented everything the law couldn't control. That's when Pat Garrett entered the story, a name that had already crossed paths with Billy's years earlier. Now the new sheriff of Lincoln County, tall, thin, methodical, a former drinking buddy turned man of the law. His mission was clear: capture Billy Bonney, dead or alive. Garrett built a web of informants, set traps, used his knowledge of Billy's habits to predict his moves. In December 1880, he captured him in a remote cabin at Stinking Springs. The kid, exhausted and surrounded, surrendered without a fight. He was taken to Mesilla and tried. The sentence was what everyone expected: hanging. Execution date, May 13, 1881. Billy reacted with indifference, as if he had already died and returned so many times that the end no longer impressed him. He was held in Lincoln, the same town that had burned his name into history. Two guards watched him in shifts, James Bell and Bob Ollinger, both armed, both confident. Ollinger taunted him daily, saying he couldn't wait to pull the trigger himself. Billy wouldn't wait for him. On the afternoon of April 28, 1881, Billy asked to use the restroom upstairs. When Bell escorted him up the staircase, Billy turned, disarmed him, and fired. The sheriff tumbled down the stairs, the shot echoing like thunder in a stone vault. Billy ran, grabbed Ollinger's shotgun from across the street and waited. When Ollinger rushed back after hearing the gunfire, Billy called to him from the window, "Hello, Bob," then pulled the trigger. 2 shots, 2 dead guards. He was free. Again. The newspapers didn't know whether to call it a crime or a miracle. The legend gained new pages. The boy who killed sheriffs, escaped prisons, and mocked justice had done the impossible once more. He mounted a horse, put on his hat, and disappeared into the frontier shadows. But even the wind gets tired of running, and the end, the real end, was getting closer. With each passing day, Billy the Kid became less a man and more a problem. The law wanted him dead. The press wanted him in headlines. The people, torn between awe and pity, wanted him immortal. He no longer lived, he endured. After his final escape, Governor Lew Wallace, the same man who had once promised him pardon, offered a new bounty, $500 for his capture. A small fortune then, but more than money. It was an official declaration of war against a ghost. The man called to end that ghost's story was the same one who had once caught him, Pat Garrett. With his reputation at stake, Garrett gathered 2 deputies, John Poe and Thomas McKinney, and quietly set out through New Mexico. The final hunt had begun. Garrett knew the land, the shadows, the hideouts. He knew how Billy thought, how he moved, where he sought refuge. The chase wasn't fast, but it was relentless. He followed clues, tracks, whispers in the sand. All led to one place, Fort Sumner, a small, hot, forgotten town. Familiar ground. It was where Billy had once found shelter, and where he had returned, maybe from fatigue, maybe nostalgia, maybe because there was nowhere left to run. On the night of July 14, 1881, Garrett and his men hid inside the house of Pete Maxwell, son of one of Billy's former allies. Maxwell, nervous, knew the kid could arrive at any moment. Outside, the air was heavy, the silence thick. Billy, unarmed and wary, entered through the back door. The interior was dark. Moonlight wasn't enough. Garrett waited inside, standing in the corner, cloaked in shadow. Soft footsteps crossed the wooden floor. Then a voice, gentle, Spanish-tinged, as Billy often spoke with his Mexican friends. "¿Quién es?" "Who's there?" Those were his last words. Garrett recognized the voice, raised his gun, fired into the dark. The shot pierced the kid's chest. He fell without a sound. He was 21 years old, 1 year for every life he took, or perhaps for every chance the world denied him. At dawn, Fort Sumner awoke in silence. The body of Billy Bonney and the kid, the fugitive, the vigilante, the orphaned boy with lightning eyes, lay stretched out in a modest room. No gunfight, no final stand. Dead, with a question still on his lips. His death was declared lawful by a local judge, no jury, no doubt. Garrett's bullet was endorsed by the townspeople. Weary of Billy's fame, the unrest, the endless cycle of escapes and headlines. The Old West wanted peace, or at least the illusion of it. And with Billy's fall came the weight of an ending era. But legends don't die with the body. The governor who had set the price on his head refused to pay the promised $500 reward to Garrett. He hid behind paperwork, excuses, and cynicism. The people, outraged, and perhaps eager to absolve their collective guilt, started a public collection. $7,000 were raised across several counties and handed to Pat Garrett. Too much money for a sheriff, too little for a man who killed a myth. Because the truth was, Billy became more dangerous dead than alive. Stories began almost instantly. Some said the body buried wasn't his, that Garrett had killed another man, that Maxwell himself had helped Billy escape. Others swore they saw him years later in Texas, Mexico, or Arizona, living under false names. Billy's youth only fueled the doubt. He was too quick, too smart. Could he have outwitted even death? These survival theories birthed a new kind of outlaw, the eternal one. And every decade a new Billy appeared. Old men claiming to be him, forged documents, disputed photographs. The story never ended. It simply retold itself. Garrett, desperate to reclaim control, wrote a book, The Authentic Life of Billy the Kid. Published in 1882, a year after the killing, it blended fact and fiction, painting Billy as a ruthless criminal, a threat neutralized. But between the lines, readers found something else: melancholy, reluctant respect, nostalgia for a time when justice rode on horseback, and names still became legend. The book sold poorly at first. It was too soon. People didn't yet know whether to honor or hate Billy. Today it stands as a primary historical source, though soaked in political motives. Garrett never escaped the kid's shadow. He died 27 years later, shot by a businessman in a land dispute. Ironically, he too became legend, because in the American West, the line between hero and villain always depended on who held the pen after the last shot. The legend had long legs, but the desert was longer. With every sunset, Billy rode deeper into the shadows of the West, and closer to the end. After his spectacular escape from Lincoln Prison, newspapers exploded like gunpowder in a matchbox. Billy the Kid escapes, kills 2 guards. Young-faced devil flees again. The whole territory trembled, not just from fear, but humiliation. Billy hadn't just killed 2 guards. He had humiliated the entire justice system of New Mexico. Governor Lew Wallace, pressured and enraged, doubled down. He renewed the official $500 bounty for Billy Bonney, dead or alive. It was more than 3 men's worth, not because of danger, but symbolism. Billy had to fall. He had to stop existing, not as a man, but as an idea. The man chosen to erase that idea was ready. Pat Garrett, sheriff of Lincoln County, Billy's former drinking companion turned executioner. Tall, stone-faced, patient, a hunter, not a fighter. He knew the kid couldn't be confronted. He had to be hunted. In July 1881, Garrett left Las Cruces with 2 deputies, John Poe and Thomas McKinney. They rode north, chasing whispers and footprints. Every town had a clue. Every saloon claimed to have seen him just 2 days ago. But everyone knew. Catching Billy wasn't about following tracks. It was about predicting ghosts. Garrett followed a hunch. Billy loved Fort Sumner. He knew the homes, trusted the people. Rumors said he had a lover there, maybe even children. It was where the orphaned boy still felt a faint sense of belonging. So Garrett rode in silence, careful, patient, like a man stalking a wounded wolf. On the night of July 14, 1881, Garrett stayed in the home of Pete Maxwell, a rancher and son of one of Billy's old allies. It was nearly midnight, the moon pale, the air dry. Outside, darkness, broken only by the faint glitter of stars. Garrett had learned that Billy was nearby, maybe a few hundred yards away, maybe already watching. Inside, he and his men waited in silence. No lamps, no words. Then at footsteps, soft, careful. Someone outside approached, barefoot, armed. It was Billy. He entered through the back door. The men in the room froze, barely breathing. Billy walked toward the dark bedroom where Garrett waited, unaware that his old friend stood there, armed and hidden. Something felt off, shadows where there shouldn't be, tension in the air. Then Billy spoke, softly in Spanish, as he always did with his Mexican friends. "¿Quién es?" "Who's there?" A whisper that cut through the darkness like a final breath. "¿Quién es?" Garrett didn't answer. He simply fired. One shot, then another. The body hit the floor. Silence. Billy the Kid was dead. He was 21. He lived fast. He died in the dark, without seeing the face that killed him. By morning, the news tore through the territory like wildfire through dry grass. Pat Garrett kills Billy the Kid. The legend is over. Outlaw king executed in ambush. The body was briefly displayed in Fort Sumner. Some wept. Some stood in silence. Most said nothing. There lay the boy who crossed time like a bullet, who mocked the law, escaped death, and laughed at order. Lying still now, blood drying on his shirt, eyes closed. Smaller than the legend claimed, more fragile, more human. But it was too late to see him as a man. Billy was already myth. A judge declared the killing lawful. Garrett had acted under the authority of the law, and the people publicly at least approved. But in the saloons and ranches, whispers spread. Billy never had a chance. Billy was shot in the back. Billy was unarmed. None of it mattered anymore. He was dead. And death seals everything. Garrett wrote his book months later, trying to defend his reputation, trying to shape the story. But he couldn't silence the rumors, nor stop the myth from growing. Billy the Kid had won, not by surviving, but by remaining. Decades later, children would still whisper the name. Movies would be made, books published, ballads composed. Historians would argue over versions, dates, guns, angles. But no version would ever surpass the silence of that night in Fort Sumner. No narrative stronger than the whisper in the dark. ¿Quién es? Billy the Kid died as he lived, surrounded by doubt, cloaked in shadows, his hand close to the holster. But in the end, the hand wasn't enough. The past caught up. The legend met its grave. And like every American legend, he became what death could not bury, a symbol. Not of crime, not of heroism, but of freedom without permission, of youth armed against an unjust world, of a time that could only be told through gunpowder. The bullet that killed Billy the Kid did not silence his story. On the contrary, it ignited something greater. The body fell to the ground in Fort Sumner, but the legend rose, untouchable, indestructible, destined to last for centuries. The next day, the territory breathed intense relief. The headline spread, "Billy the Kid is dead." But the weight of the sentence sounded like a question mark. Dead? Or just hiding? The face was known. The scar on the chin, the hollow eyes, the smile that never laughed. And yet something felt incomplete, as if a man made of escapes couldn't die without one last run. Governor Lew Wallace, the same man who promised pardon and then denied it, now said nothing. The $500 reward he had proudly announced in saloons and telegraph offices was never paid. Pat Garrett, the man who had risked his life, faced public judgment and executed the living legend of the territory, received only official silence. It was the people, not the government, who reacted. Citizens, merchants, and sympathizers organized a public collection. They raised over $7,000, a fortune for the time, and handed it to Garrett, not out of gratitude, but perhaps out of relief. Or fear. Fear that without him, Billy might come back. But ironically, the harder justice tried to bury the past, the more the past spread like powder in the wind. Billy the Kid was never forgotten. He was reinvented. Every man in the territory told a different version. Some said he escaped, that the body in Fort Sumner was someone else, a decoy, a pawn. Others swore they saw him riding through Arizona months later, or mining in Colorado, or living in Mexico, married to a dark-haired woman and raising children far from gunfire. Theories grew out of silence. The miraculous escapes, the eternal youth, the impossible speed, all conspired to create the impossible, a ghost with a body. Even dead, Billy was more alive than ever. And so, like every hunter who must justify his prey, Pat Garrett picked up the pen. The year after Billy's death in 1882, Garrett published a book, The Authentic Life of Billy the Kid. The title was bold, authentic. But it wasn't just a report. It was a defense. Garrett needed to explain why he killed a man without warning, why a friend became a target, why the shot fired in darkness should be seen as justice, not revenge. Written with journalist Ash Upson, the book blended fact with flourish, detail with drama. It was as much construction as confession. It painted Billy as a charming devil, a charismatic killer, an enemy of order, but always with a trace of admiration. Garrett wanted to end the story, but unknowingly he helped immortalize it. The book sold poorly. The public wasn't ready for the ending. They didn't want the real Billy. They wanted the myth, and myths aren't explained, they're felt. Over time, Garrett's work became a primary historical source, studied by scholars, adapted by filmmakers, cited by writers. Not for its absolute accuracy, but because it captured the spirit of an era. The tension of the frontier, the moral complexity of a boy who became the symbol of a country torn between law and freedom. Billy the Kid's legacy doesn't belong to justice or to truth. It belongs to what Americans build best, foundational myths, like Jesse James, Davy Crockett, and Geronimo. Billy became more than he was. From wanted gunman to folk hero, from criminal to t-shirt icon, from fugitive to symbol of untamed youth. Today, his name lives on in road signs on dusty highways, in towns that profit from his legend, in museums that sell bullet cases and calendars with his photo. And that one photo, the grainy black-and-white portrait from 1879, where he stands armed, hat tilted, eyes locked on the camera, became both an icon and a prison. Because with only one image to compare, every imposter seemed possible, and none convincing. But Billy didn't find eternity in the courts. He found it on the screen. From the 1930s onward, Billy the Kid became a Hollywood hero. No longer the cruel outlaw, but the romantic gunslinger, fighting corrupt sheriffs, protecting the weak, falling in love with damsels. In just 2 years, between 1949 and 1950, 42 films were released featuring Billy as the protagonist. Yes, 42 films in 2 years. The Old West was at its peak, and the boy gunned down in Fort Sumner had become a blue-eyed heartthrob with a golden soul. Decades later, the myth evolved again. In the 1980s and 1990s, Billy returned with Emilio Estevez's face in the Young Guns films. Now he was portrayed as something between rebel and anti-hero, charismatic, tragic, a free spirit doomed from birth. Youth itself, raw, wild, defiant, became the story's heartbeat. Billy wasn't just a gunslinger anymore. He was youth personified, armed against the world. Even Garrett's book, once ignored, found new life in film scripts and adaptations, part biography, part confession, part reckoning. Today, Billy the Kid isn't just a character. He's a genre, an archetype, a mirror reflecting the American longing for ruleless freedom and the melancholy of knowing it never lasts. If you've made it this far, it means this story still beats somewhere inside you. And if the legend of Billy the Kid still rides through your imagination, don't let the trail go cold. Like this video, if the journey gripped you till the end. Subscribe for more epic tales like this, stories that time tried to erase but memory refuses to forget. And tell us in the comments, was Billy a hero, a villain, or just the right boy in the wrong place, with a gun in his hand and the world against him?